Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. The War Bride's Oath. Episode 16. They watched the reaction in the central plaza, the crowd immediately turning their heads to see where the loud growl had come from. Many immediately spotted the dragon, pointing up at the sky. People screamed, but some almost sounded like they were loudly cheering the appearance of another legendary creature. The members of the Dorosave and Seson tribes that were present looked ecstatic as they already knew about Cray, and the presence of another dragon could only mean the princess had received reinforcements. As expected, the Yekara were not among those who rejoiced. From where she stood, Cecilia very clearly saw the face of the man who was standing on the execution deck sink, his jaw dropping. Right after that, he began shouting orders, angrily pointing at the sky, spitting words to his men on the ground. Tessandra smiled next to her. Their plan was working. In just minutes, half of the Yekara soldiers present on the plaza moved to the inner wall, their eyes regularly checking the sky above. Because they were on the same level as the crowd, it was hard to see exactly how many soldiers remained. They could see at least 24 of them still blocking the crowd from approaching the platform. With the prospect of a dragon coming to their rescue and so many soldiers leaving, the whole area grew louder. The locals became even more vehement in their protests and were trying to break through the line of soldiers, not hesitating to try and shove them. Cecilia was growing nervous, waiting for Nana's signal. Was she in her designated spot yet? She hoped the young woman wouldn't run into any trouble, and found herself glad she had 2 of the triplets by her friend's side. Gently, Ashen suddenly touched her hand. Cecilia turned to him, and he gave her a confident nod. "It's going to be all right," he muttered. "I know." Cecilia was most nervous for him. Despite him hiding it well, the king was still heavily injured. What her brother's blood had done probably wasn't enough to completely heal an injury of that size. Ashen should have had a few days to rest, not head into another battle the next morning. Cecilia held on even more tightly to the handle of her sword, determined. Now, she couldn't afford to hesitate again. Lives were at stake, and her enemies were clear. She didn't have to stop herself from killing or withhold her attacks. The Yekara were soldiers and traitors. This was a real war, not a simple duel between 2 young women. Taking a deep breath to calm herself, she glanced to the side. Tessandra's eyes were fixated on Sabale, her dark eyes so piercing it was as if she was trying to dig a hole in the platform under his feet. How far away were they? How long could it take? Perhaps 2 minutes? However, those would be long minutes cutting through the crowd from here to there. Any time now. The tension in the room was getting heavier with each passing second. Since the crowd had spotted Kian, the dragons had probably already landed at the bridges, ready to begin guarding their own, meaning that Neptune was the one to signal when the fights would start. Suddenly, they heard it. A large explosion, followed by a sudden blue flash in the sky. Although everyone had been prepared to run, they couldn't help but glance back to see how such a thing had been done. From the flash, only a large blue fire could now be seen in the distance, already quieting down under the rain. "Go!" shouted Aglythia. Their troops poured into the streets, Cecilia and her friends first. She and Tessandra both ran into the first trio of Yekara soldiers, who didn't even get a second to understand what was happening before simultaneously getting transpierced by the two women's blades. Their eyes still wide open in shock, they slid off the blades and fell aside, Cassandra and Cecilia already running past them. It was total chaos in the street. The sudden arrival of dozens of fighters had thrown the Yekara into a complete disarray. Not only that, but the techniques of the Cheshi, who seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, from the sky or a blind spot, weren't giving them any time to regroup either. Even the townsfolk were surprised and trying to get out of the way, the most combative ones still pushing to access the guarded platform. Cecilia, Cassandra, and Ashen were unstoppable. Unlike the Cheshi who launched sudden and swift attacks, they were progressing in the open, restlessly slaying anyone in their way. Because they were the easiest to spot and attack on the way to the platform, the Yekara kept aiming at them first, thinking they'd be the first ones to stop. They were incredibly wrong. The pair of cousins were such a perfect match, covering each other's backs and synchronizing their attacks, that it looked like they were progressing with minimal effort. To those not fighting, it was a dance they wanted to stay away from and yet, quite amazing to look at. Despite the dark skies, their armor was shining brightly through the crowd, and those who recognized what they were actually made of grew even more admirative. The crowd that wasn't fighting was cheering for the duo of women fighting through the crowd, getting out of the way for them to make progress. It was still quite a dense crowd. What had only seemed like a couple minutes' journey earlier was now turning into an awful amount of fighting and pushing through. The Yekara soldiers seemed to have received orders at some point, seeing as they thickened their ranks with reinforcements, their numbers growing larger and blocking the duo's way. Right behind them, the king was making as much of an impression. From what they could hear, the Yekara's lies about his death had reached a lot of the inhabitants, and many of those present were celebrating their king's return. While some had figured out the lie, others were happily rejoicing about their king coming back from the underworld for the second time. No one could tell which version would make it into history. "Somebody get to that platform!" Cassandra shouted between two sword swings. Cecilia glanced ahead. The situation was urgent. The Yekara soldiers were only good at slowing them down, but that might actually make them lose the time they needed to rescue Sabale and the others. They were still entirely too far, and even the Cheshi that were trying to get to the platform were stopped. In fact, the central plaza was vast, and there were no buildings around that they could jump from. Everyone had to get there by foot, and the crowd was like an army between them and the platform. With horror, they saw the man on the platform gesture to hurry and start the executions. The two cousins exchanged a glance. They didn't have time to deal with the small fry. "Ceci, help me!" Cecilia nodded, and suddenly ran ahead, while her cousin went back, making everyone around completely confused. While Cecilia was left to battle alone, her cousin took several steps back, before turning around, and placing her weapons back in her belt. What was she preparing? While everyone was still confused, she began running straight at Cecilia as if she was about to fight her. The speed of her run was impressive, though, enough that people actually ran to get out of the way, fearing the cannonball. However, Cassandra was aiming at her cousin alone, and, to everyone's surprise, Cecilia suddenly grabbed a random Yekara soldier among many, and used her sword at record speed. In the blink of an eye, the man was defeated on the ground, while Cecilia was holding his chest plate in her hands. Her cousin was still running at a terrifying speed toward her, but Cecilia defeated another man using that plate like a hammer, and let him fall on top of the previous man. She then stepped on both of them, and squatted down, holding the plate above her head. People understood what was going to happen 1 second before it actually did. Tessandra reached her, and leapt in the air. She landed on the plate for less than a second, when Cecilia, with a loud grunt, used her whole body to project it higher, giving her cousin an incredible jump base. Tessandra jumped, and for a few seconds, it seemed almost as if she was flying above the crowd. Her figure was absolutely perfect, her eyes riveted on the platform. She made a perfect arc before landing brutally, rolling on the floor and getting back up, her swords already out. What happened next was like a tornado unchained, blood flying on the closest bystanders, even the Yekara soldiers who just had the time to turn around and realize they were already too late. Tessandra's twin swords were flying around, cutting throats and freeing their allies from their ropes. The platform had become an execution stage indeed, but not the one intended. Everyone was watching the fighting with a mix of awe and fear. Tessandra was like a goddess of wrath on a wild rampage. Strangely, though, she had left one man tied, while the other hostages had been let free and had run off the platform already. He was watching her do her little show, a wry smile on his lips. When it was only the two of them left on the platform, for a brief moment before more Yekara soldiers came up, did she turn to him, out of breath but a fierce smile stuck on her face. "Hey there, handsome," she chuckled. "Miss me much?" "I was wondering why you left me tied," sighed Cesilia. "Should I be worried that you're enjoying this position a bit too much?" Tessandra bit her lower lip, looking him up and down. He was held with his wrists tied above his head, and his feet barely touching the floor. She chuckled and glanced down, her eyes stopping on his exposed abs, her fingers softly touching them and making him shiver. Maybe," she said, "but I do not like seeing you all injured, handsome." "It's not like I gave them permission to," he sighed. "I know," said Tessandra, caressing his cheek. "Only I get to kick you." She finally cut down the rope holding him with a smug smile, but, to her surprise, Cesilia suddenly pulled her into a passionate kiss. In the crowd, Cecilia, who had lifted her eyes, catching a break and to see how the situation was on the platform, happened to witness that moment, and chuckled, surprised by Cesilia's boldness. She hoped Neptune was somewhere she could also witness this. Back on the platform, Tessandra was so shocked she had almost dropped her swords, only holding her arms apart so she wouldn't mistakenly stab her lover. When Cesilia ended their kiss, she stood there, a bit speechless. What was that? She blushed uncontrollably, trying to stay cool still. "I really missed you," he sighed. Tessandra cleared her throat, trying to hide her embarrassment, and suddenly remembered to lower her arms. "I may have missed you too. You're not too embarrassed to be rescued by a lady?" "Not really. That will be a cool story to tell our kids later." He smiled and grabbed a sword abandoned on the platform, quickly stretching his shoulders that were most likely sore before beginning to fight off the soldiers that were climbing up to stop them. Meanwhile, Tessandra was left behind, still processing what he had just said. "Kids!" she exclaimed. "Our kids, you said. She rejoined the fight excitedly by his side, the two of them pretty much unstoppable. They completely dominated the platform, despite the Yekura's attempts to reconquer it. On the ground, a few steps away, Cecilia had also made great progress, Ashen replacing Tessandra by her side in the pit. She caught sight of her cousin joyfully fighting beside her lover. They had managed to rescue everyone there, but that was only the first part of the plan. Just as she thought so, another flash blinded everyone, a red one this time. The fighting had begun on the other side, in the area where Cashin and Lady Bastat were supposed to stand together. How many Yekura were they possibly facing? It was impossible to know. Now that they were in the open, Cecilia was actually able to turn her head and spot Neptune, standing on a roof with a gigantic fire by her side. She wasn't alone, it seemed, with three smaller silhouettes by her side. Two of the triplets and another ally? She looked safe and sound for now, but now, her position was known to everyone. Next to Cecilia, several Yekuras shouted to grab her, their fingers pointing toward the roof where the bright red fire was slowly dying. Cecilia chopped off one of the arms close to her, the limb falling at her feet with the finger still extended. While her victim cried, she glanced in Neptune's direction again. Luckily, her friend was already gone, evidently aware of the danger. "We need to get to the castle," suddenly declared Ashen by her side. Cecilia nodded, glancing beyond the platform. They were still many streets away from the castle, but it wasn't undoable. In fact, if most of the fight happened here, it won't be long until they can reconquer the castle. Moreover, the landscape was changing around them. From just a few protesters, the streets were now getting crowded with angry citizens, each wanting to give a piece of their mind to the Yekura people. Some were only shouting, but many had found whatever weapons they could, and were fearlessly threatening to use pans and pitchforks against the soldiers. Still, they couldn't do much fighting against trained and experienced warriors. Cecilia was worried the mob would get hurt if things got out of hand. Not only that, but despite their efforts, the number of enemies just kept rising as they continued to get more support coming. It was as if soldiers in red poured out of everywhere. Soon, she understood why. Some of those people wore the attire of Yekuras, but they were clearly mercenaries until not too long ago. They didn't show the discipline to follow orders, and were trying to intimidate the crowd with violence. They didn't work well in groups either, thus they were quickly isolated by the angry crowd, provoking little fights left and right in the streets. It looked like the central plaza was the epicenter of a situation that was gradually getting worse in the streets. Anger was rising, and the citizens, fueled by the return of their king, were visibly at a breaking point in their patience toward the despicable actions of the Yekura. Cecilia could hear their complaints about their houses being searched and, for a lot of them, robbed by their aggressors. Those people were no fighters, but that morning, they were getting confidence from the global movement of protests occurring everywhere. In fact, angry shouting and protests could be heard coming from all directions, people loudly expressing their anger and shoving the soldiers in red if they were brave enough to. Cecilia was as impressed as she was scared. People were gathering in protest without them even having to do anything, the word of mouth already waking up every house, all families ready to fight back. If the Yekura had taken the streets overnight, their dominion was now being pushed back, people urging them to get out of their streets, insulting them and ganging up against them when the strength was lacking. Although, this surely wouldn't be enough. The main leaders weren't there, but Cecilia could see their troops already preparing. She doubted they had put their main forces in the streets when they were expecting them to come and fight back. Ashen was right, they had to head to the castle to end this as soon as possible. Luckily, Cesilia and Tessandra were gathering a lot of attention on the platform, and the soldiers were now splitting up to fight the two couples, making it easier for Cecilia and Ashen to take the way around to the castle while Tessandra and Cesilia kept them busy there. "Tessa, you have to guide the people in the streets," Cecilia shouted. "Just go," retorted her cousin, grunting. "I'll let you know if the situation gets here." She then grabbed Cesilia's hand, urging him to jump off the platform, before she suddenly turned around and exhaled a fireball, not the biggest one, but enough to aggressively set the wooden deck on fire, and the men still on it. Cecilia nodded, and with Ashen, began running toward the castle. Aglithia was appearing next to her from time to time, jumping out of what seemed like nowhere to mercilessly murder a soldier, before disappearing again. Her technique was impressive, but it didn't allow for grouped attacks. The Cheshi were supporting them the best they could, but then, Cecilia realized, there was a lot more going on. More fighters appeared, all dressed in black, swiftly jumping on the Cheshi, assassinating the fighters just as quickly as the Cheshi murdered the Yekara. She suddenly got into close contact with one of the masked assassins, too quick for Cecilia to push them back, when Ashen jumped in front, blocking the attack with his large sword. He brutally kicked the aggressor in the chest, and pinned him down to the ground, ripping their mask off. Like the Cheshi, they had distinctive traits, strange black stripes tattooed on their faces. "Those Kunu," growled Ashen. "We will have our revenge," shouted the man under his sword, spitting a mouthful of blood on his last words. "You wish." He twisted his sword, finishing his opponent, and looked around, spotting the flying fighters with a sullen expression. "We don't have time to lose with them," he hissed. "Let us deal with them," said Aglithia, suddenly appearing by their side. "The Kunu have been our rivals for a while, we should be the ones to deal with them." "Just go, your majesties." Cecilia and Ashen nodded and ran ahead, only getting rid of those who stood in their way or tried to attack from above. The central plaza had turned into a full-on battlefield, with the large fire pit started by Tessandra in the middle. Not many would be able to follow them into the castle, indicating a hard fight ahead. Still, neither of them slowed down until they reached the first doors to the entrance of it. Suddenly, a loud growl was heard, and they lifted their heads. Its body circled up around the castle's main tower, claws digging into its stone walls. Jin the Red Dragon was glaring at them. "You should have finished them off," hissed Ashen, glaring at the dragon. Cecilia thought otherwise, but she was still shocked at the dragon's angry attitude. Jin was clearly threatening them. It might have been the first foreign dragon she met, but Cecilia was still experienced enough to understand the meaning of a dragon's growl. This was clearly an angry, menacing one. It wasn't close enough to actually attack unless it came down, but the red dragon was visibly bent on guarding this place. If Jin was there, did that mean Giselle was in the castle as well? Cecilia didn't like that woman, but she didn't want to hold on to her resentment toward her either. The Yekara and Ashen's adopted brother were their target, and they had already ditched her, so what was that woman possibly doing in there? Why had she returned? Cecilia had once felt pity toward Giselle's circumstances, it was that of many women before her. Still, if she wanted to survive this, Giselle should have left with her dragon when she had the chance to. Cecilia and her brothers had spared her once, they weren't so nice as to do it twice. There was no one guarding the first gate, but Cecilia and Ashen ran into trouble as soon as the castle door was in sight. A dozen new Yekara soldiers were lined up there guarding the entrance, clearly waiting for them, spears and swords ready. "Will you be all right? I'm just getting started." Cecilia smiled faintly. Ashen looked completely fine indeed and, from seeing the way he fought with superb moves, no one would have known he had been severely wounded just the night before. Side by side, a handful of Cheshi fighters behind them, they fearlessly cut through the lines of Yekara and traitorous royal guards trying to stop them. Despite the numbers, the difference in strength was massive. Ashen's sword could cut 3 men's waists in a single swing, violently cutting down anyone who stood in his way. A few steps away from him, Cecilia was less messy, but perhaps even more efficient. Her movements were incredibly quick, precise, and deadly. Bodies fell beneath her with minimal amounts of blood shed, most of the time with only a vital point sliced open, or fatal injuries that left them seconds to live. In just minutes, the two of them cleared their way through the gate with impressive ease, the Cheshi behind them having provided minimal support. They finally stopped moving, all their opponents dead or almost, and exchanged a glance, out of breath. "Ladies first," said Ashen. He was a bit more exhausted than she was, his torso heaving up and down under his armor. Cecilia was glad the one she had picked was perfectly protecting his injury, but also helping his posture. Whoever had crafted this truly knew the needs of a dragon warrior. She stepped ahead, and kicked the door open for the two of them, her weapons at the ready for the next fight. Luckily, there were less soldiers guarding the entrance of the castle, the room being too large and circular had probably convinced them there was no point in defending such a vast area. Moreover, from there on, the castle was going to be divided in narrow corridors, enclosed spaces, and a handful of large rooms. There would be more than enough places more efficient than there to put a defense up. In fact, Ashen and Cecilia left the Cheshi fighters that had come with them to deal with those, while they were still catching a break, glancing around. "Chances are hiding in the throne room or the banquet hall," he said. "They will try to keep us from killing your adopted brother," nodded Cecilia. "They can try. I can't wait to get rid of him once and for all, if he really is alive." That was what they had heard so far. Cecilia herself was surprised, if that was true. From what she had seen, his body had been crushed by rocks. Perhaps he had survived, but he ought to have lost a limb or two, at the very least. She couldn't understand why the Yekara clan leader was holding on to that man instead of taking the throne for himself. He could have simply taken over, declaring he had been named by their fake, very brief king to take his succession. Or was it that he doubted he would be recognized as a legitimate leader? It turned out Ashen's brother wasn't much more welcomed by the people, though. No one was blind as to who was truly behind all this. "Cecilia." Ashen gently called her name, and extended his free hand for her to take. Together, they climbed the stairs first, trusting that Cheshi would catch up with them, or spread out in the castle to get rid of more Yekara soldiers. This was more their kind of battleground, after all. Unlike the plaza from earlier where they had been completely exposed, this time they could execute light-speed attacks and disappear right after. While climbing up, Cecilia tried to catch sight of what was going on outside through the windows. Not only in the central plaza, which she could spot in a blink, but also farther away, where her brothers and the dragons stood. She could see more fights going on, and Qian's shiny figure defending one of the bridges. It was harder to figure out the situation on the other one, but Darson seemed to be doing fine, standing in the middle of the bridge, the bright orange armor shining through while dozens of little silhouettes were regularly thrown off to fall into the river below. She couldn't see Cashin's situation, as her brother's location was caught between all the buildings, but she could guess. It was probably like everywhere else, dozens of citizens flocking the streets to fight back with them, and Lady Bastat's tribe gathering at his side. So much had happened during such a short amount of time, Cecilia could only hope the losses on their side would be minimal. She could also see more people gathering outside the outer wall, hundreds of little dots moving toward the doors. Who knew how long the bridges could be defended before people managed to force their way in? It wasn't as if Ashen and herself weren't busy as well. Cecilia was astounded with how many people got in their way. How long had the Yekara been preparing this? How many people had they corrupted to make the castle so guarded? At each new corridor, there was another fight. Ashen's castle had suddenly turned into a maze that was not welcoming them back. Not only that, but Cecilia realized there had been a lot more fights than she had thought after they had fled the cave. There were signs of battle almost everywhere. They even ran into some royal guards' bodies abandoned here and there, most likely those who had tried to resist. Ashen's anger gradually rose as he saw more and more of them. When they pushed the door to another room, finding 3 more bodies and a lot of blood spilled everywhere, the furniture wrecked, the floor and walls covered in blood, his piercing black eyes stayed on the bodies. If only I had gotten rid of the Yekara earlier. I should have known they wouldn't be satisfied with a seat and a title. All my guards. You couldn't have known, gently muttered Cecilia, putting a hand on his shoulder. You needed their help back then. It isn't your fault. No, it is, Cecilia. It's been my mistake all along. I refused to handle all the responsibilities alone, and I tried to persuade myself I could let the leaders decide with me to divide the burden. That was so wrong. Not only did I let them do what they wanted under my nose, but I didn't even get to do anything worth it for all the tribes that deserved it. That's not true. It's not as if the tribes resent you, and they know you didn't just give in to the Yekara either. He closed his fist and didn't answer, but Cecilia could tell from his expression that he wasn't satisfied with that. Ashen was carrying his guilt all over his face, but that was his burden to bear. Cecilia knew he had faced too much at way too young an age. She knew most of the lords didn't blame him, but at the very least, recognizing his own wrongs would only make him a better king, even if it was another painful lesson learned. She looked down. He had let go of her hand again. She frowned and suddenly grabbed his face between her hands, forcing him gently but firmly to look at her. Ashen opened his eyes wide at her, stunned. Cecilia actually took him by surprise. You may not have been the best king, she said, but you are a good man, Ashen. So please, don't close yourself to the people who want to help you. I will be with you from now on. I'm not leaving you. If you made mistakes, we can repair them, together. I want to stay by your side. I know, he muttered. He gently held her hand against his cheek, and moved his head slightly to kiss her palm. I don't think we have a lot of time for that, Cecilia blushed. Later, he whispered. After all this is over, I want to spend all the time I have with you. It's a promise, then. It is. She smiled, feeling a bit shy. It felt almost outrageous that the two of them could still be so loving toward each other in such a situation. Yet, her heart felt as if it was overflowing with love for him. Ashen had changed and, if possible, he had become even more handsome in her eyes. She really wanted to hug him, but they didn't have the time for that. Instead, she put a quick kiss on his lips, leaving him with a smile on. Thanks, he muttered. For what? For being so patient with this stubborn lover of yours. Cecilia blushed and chuckled, and they finally parted, although still holding hands, tighter than before. As they were just about to leave the spot they were in, a loud dragon growl was heard in the distance. They ran to the closest window, immediately spotting the large red fire Neptune had just set as a warning. At least, she was fine. Meanwhile, their eyes quickly found the large black dragon next, exactly on the bridge they had positioned it at, being assaulted by a myriad of strange ants. The humans had found ways to breach the gate, and began crawling onto the bridge, trying to get past the large dragon. They would probably take a while before managing to get past Cray, but that still wasn't anywhere near good news for them. It meant the Yekara allies had already won over that side of the outer capital. Let's get going, groaned Ashen. The sooner we finish things here, the sooner we can go and get rid of the ones outside. Will your father's dragon be all right? Of course, nodded Cecilia. It's my father's dragon, after all. Darson probably told him not to use his fire, but there is no way Cray will lose to a group of humans. Ashen nodded. He knew the power of the dragons enough himself. They turned away from the window, and began running up the stairs again. They were now more eager than ever to end this, especially as they could hear the ruckus echoing throughout the castle, coming from both above and below. Had more of their allies entered the castle as well? Or were those the Yekara reinforcements coming to take down the king? Hard to tell, as all the sounds were distorted and echoed irregularly, but it only made them speed up. The fights encountered on the way were easy, but they were slowly wearing them down for sure, which somehow seemed to be their goal. All the soldiers they ran into were primarily aiming to end Ashen's life, targeting his injury and trying to injure him no matter what, which made Cecilia suspect they were afraid of him getting upstairs the most. The real, legitimate king being alive was a huge thorn in the Yekara leader's plan, and his adopted brothers. They needed to get rid of him, to end the fights outside and prove the king was dead. There probably weren't enough men in the whole castle to stop their duo, though. After many fights faced together, against 1 to a dozen people at once, Cecilia and Ashen had already found the best ways to work together, now forming a perfect pair of fighters. Even in tight areas, or against several scattered enemies, they were undefeatable. Following her brother's suggestion, Cecilia wasn't restraining herself anymore and, when she truly hesitated again, Ashen was there to give the finishing blow. His presence was making her more determined, especially as they were protecting each other. She was keeping his injury in mind, and trying to cover any blind spot of his in each fight. It was also a huge advantage that they had both been trained by the war god himself. Like Tessandra and her siblings, their fighting style was suitable to complete each other efficiently. "We're almost there," he announced after another set of stairs. "The next one is the throne room." Cecilia hadn't had enough days to accustom herself to the complex castle structure, but she did recognize the corridors they had been in for a few minutes now. Her blood rushed even faster in her veins, her stomach burning at the thought of the upcoming, final fight. They hadn't caught sight of Cesilia yet, but she didn't doubt that the woman was there. From time to time, they could hear Jin climbing around the castle, the red dragon's claws making a terrible ruckus against the castle's weaker stones. Cecilia just couldn't call out her brother's dragon for help yet. First, she didn't know how Qian and Cashin's fights were going at the moment, and secondly, she still wasn't sure about Cecilia's real intentions of coming back to the castle. Something definitely felt off about her dragon's presence, and Cecilia wanted to make the situation clear before killing her. Ashen pushed the door, and without much surprise, they found the room filled with more Yekara soldiers or hired mercenaries and, at the very back, Lord Yebek, standing next to the throne with Ashen's adopted brother on it. A strange silence followed their arrival. Cecilia roughly counted about 20 fighters in the room, but her eyes were more attracted to the duo hiding at the back. Lord Yebek had a vicious smile on, his arm leaning against the throne. Had he been injured too? He looked like he was leaning strangely, but then again, he was wearing a long cape hiding most of his body. Next to him, Ashen's adopted brother, on the other hand, was in a terrible state, just as she had imagined. It was unbelievable that they had just propped him up there, on the throne, when his condition was that bad. He was missing an arm and leg, and the half of his body she had seen crushed was now covered in bandages soaked with blood. His eyes were open, but his lips were purple, and his eyes looked strange, as if he couldn't focus them properly. Even from across the room, Cecilia could guess he had a fever. Strangely, though, something that looked like a wooden and metallic leg was laid against the throne, as if it was ready to be used. A prosthetic? What were they expecting to do with that? That, and the strange bottle he was holding in his only hand, were confusing Cecilia, making her even more nervous. "There he is!" exclaimed Lord Yebek with an amused expression. "The White King defies death, yet again. And he returns with the war god's daughter by his side, of course." His eyes went to Cecilia but, far from the theatrical impression he was trying to put on, he couldn't help but glare at her. Cecilia withheld his hateful gaze, not impressed in the slightest. She was more intrigued about what in the world that madman had done to Ashen's adopted brother. "You're surprisingly tenacious, Your Highness," he continued. "I've heard that you survived thanks to the war god's daughter, but I didn't think that on top of being saved by a woman, you'd have to hide behind her all this time." Ashen scoffed. "That's all you have for me, Yebek? Sorry to disappoint, but I'm not ashamed to admit she's much stronger than I am. Sadly, at the moment, you're my problem and you've brought him here to threaten my kingdom, so I'll be the one to deal with you. Oh, I'm afraid not, chuckled Yebek. See, I've kept all my very best warriors here to stop you. And even if you do manage to survive this, your adopted brother will finish you, so everyone knows who the real heir to this kingdom is. Ashen glanced around. Indeed, the fighters present in this room looked nothing like the amateurs they had been dealing with since earlier. These were trained, experienced fighters and warriors, each with their own weapons. Next to him, Cecilia was also glaring at the group facing them. Just like him, she acknowledged these were no ordinary fighters and would put up much more of a fight than the ones they had to deal with until now. What do you think? He asked her in a mutter. Nothing you can't handle. But I'll save you some time, for everyone's sake. Fine. But my adopted brother is mine to fight. You leave him to me. Yes, I know. Ashen smiled and, to Yebeka's surprise, stepped to the side, leaving Cecilia plenty of space by his side, both of them raising their weapons, ready to go at it again. At the other end of the room, Yebeka's expression fell. He had probably hoped for Ashen to tell Cecilia to stay out of this, since his male pride was doubted out loud, but it didn't work. The king had grown enough already, and had no issue with acknowledging his female partner's undeniable strength. Ah! Fine. You two shall die together, then. His words resonated like a call to attack, and the men facing them jumped at the same time. The space wasn't as confined as before, but it certainly wasn't ideal to fight 20 people at once, either. Everything was happening at an incredible speed, and from the very first second, both Ashen and Cecilia quickly realized Yebek hadn't exaggerated his men's strength, they were nothing like the ones they had fought earlier. The amount of pure strength used in that battle was unbelievable, and each clash of swords was incredibly brutal. Soon, the two lovers were forced to stand back to protect each other, and had to move quickly to keep up with the attacks coming from all sides. Their enemies were also experienced enough to not let the space become an issue, they scattered around their opponents, sometimes leaving others to attack first, before attacking themselves. Ashen and Cecilia didn't have a moment of rest, and were even struggling to keep up at times. Cecilia feared for Ashen's life more than once. He only received minor injuries, but the strain put on his body was bound to become an issue sooner or later. Even she had to use all of her strength to keep those people at bay, and several times, she grunted loudly. The first body didn't hit the ground until several minutes later, their opponents incredibly tenacious. Moreover, even if the previous fights had been easy, Ashen and Cecilia had already fought dozens of fights against several people before coming here, while those fighters had obviously been waiting here all along. The tiredness was starting to show in their movements, and they had to gather all their strength to keep up. She even stopped listening to the dragon growls that had been informing her of what was going on outside. She could only focus on what was going on here, if she wanted to survive this. Ceci. Suddenly, a second of distraction in a wrong angle put her in danger. She saw the blade, slicing past her skin, and felt Ashen's large hand pulling her in the opposite direction. Cecilia gasped, shocked herself, and violently landed against the opposite wall. Her reflexes taking over, she got back on her feet, but Ashen was already in front, protecting her while they had been pushed against the wall. Sorry, she muttered, mad at herself. "Don't," he grunted. "Are you all right?" Cecilia nodded. She only briefly glanced at her injured arm, deep indeed, but the silver scales were already taking over. She resumed the fight, before it hit her. Silver? She kept fighting, trying hard not to make the same mistake twice and risk putting Ashen in danger, but tried to glance at her arm again. The scales weren't silver, but a dark grey. Had she dreamt it again? It was the second time. Before, when she had injured her palm, she had thought for a second that the little scales in her hand had been of a shiny tone, before realizing it was as ash dark as before. What was wrong with her? She tried to push those dark thoughts away and resumed the fight, even angrier because of her mistake. Ashen had had to withhold their opponents in her stead for a few seconds, but those could have been fatal to him. In fact, he was already covered in sweat and grunting. Luckily, their armor was doing an amazing job of protecting them every time the enemy managed to hit them. The shiny scales seemed to deflect each blade, the shock barely felt on the skin underneath. Cecilia was surprised at how light they were compared to their defensive power. The weapons weren't getting dull either, and followed each of their movements with incredible precision. Cecilia had never been too fond of swords, but the ones she was holding now might just be the ones to change that. There was clearly a difference in the craft of the Dragon Empire's blacksmiths. The armor and their weapons might be what kept them going for so long. There was a huge difference between fighters who held perfect weapons and armor for their needs, of an incredibly good craft, and those who held standard ones. It was as if Ashen and Cecilia were fighting with legend-level weaponry, while the Yekara soldiers only held high-value ones. Their enemies' weapons were starting to fail them, giving them a slight advantage. Two men lost their lives shortly after their armor was broken open by Ashen's heavy blade, and Cecilia swung around at record speed to get two more men's weak points, slicing their napes without an ounce of hesitation. She and Ashen were in a perfectly synchronized dance of death, and instead of getting more and more tired, they were getting gradually more dangerous. Cecilia's eyes had transformed into a dark green reptilian stare, scaring her enemies before coldly killing them. She truly was the war god's daughter, moving around so swiftly while sowing death around her. Ashen's movements were just as beautiful, but much more of a brutal force, like a dragon relentlessly attacking with all fangs out, ripping flesh apart and violently breaking bones. Slowly but surely, they were reducing the numbers of their opponents. Each time a Yekara warrior fell, the remaining ones felt as if the strength of their enemies doubled. Even for experienced fighters, there was a fine line between amazement and fear. They knew the duo they were fighting weren't ordinary fighters, but they couldn't help but be bewildered by the woman's incredibly precise moves and the king's colossal strength. Even Lord Yebek was left to watch in awe, mouth open at the two warriors, until he realized it was his men on the ground. "What are you doing? Kill them! You incapable, you call yourselves our best fighters. You better kill them, or you'll die." The weakness of that threat had no effect on his men, who had already been fighting for their lives for the past several minutes. Now that they had been reduced to less than half their original number, they had no time to rest at all. Far from looking overwhelmed and outnumbered, Cecilia and Ashen looked like they were making a point of keeping their opponents from catching any break at all. Suddenly, another loud growl resonated, but much closer this time, sounding like it was coming from all around them. Even worse, the tower they were in brutally shook, as if an earthquake was coming from above. The fight stopped, all fighters looking up with a common reaction. Cecilia's heart went cold. That was Jin. He had climbed onto that area of the castle. She and Ashen were luckily in the middle of the room, away from the windows, but that wouldn't help them much if that dragon decided to destroy the entire tower. That foolish dragon, shouted Lord Yebek, glaring at the ceiling. Get off the tower, you useless of a reptile. Cecilia glared at the man. How could he shout at the dragon like that? No dragon she knew would have let a human insult them like that without biting their head off in retaliation if they understood, and nobody stopped them. Yet, Yebek kept vociferating at Jin as if it was just a bad runt. What did you do to that dragon? She hissed, glaring past the fighters at their master. The man scoffed. Me? Nothing. As it turns out, its master is nothing but a stupid wench who knows she needs us to survive. Her dragon obeys me now. Cecilia didn't believe that for a single second. Dragons couldn't simply be given to someone like one would change a pet's owner. Cray was her father's dragon, and although it had come along with her, the black dragon couldn't understand her like it would have her father. It wasn't her dragon, it was merely reflecting her father's protective feelings for her. She knew a part of the reason her father had sent Cray with her wasn't just for her security, but so he would miss his child less. He had already done that countless times with his wife. A dragon didn't completely mirror its owner's feelings, but it could understand them better than anyone. Even if Jin's owner had died, her brother's love for Giselle couldn't be simply overthrown by a man's orders. You threatened her, hissed Cecilia, angry. You used Giselle to manipulate her dragon. Yebek laughed. Manipulate? This woman is so foolish and yet cunning herself, I would hardly call that manipulation. Did I do anything different than you, princess? That black dragon isn't yours either, is it? Ha! How ironic, isn't it? For a prince to have found you, of all people. You're the dragonless princess, so useless you have to come accompanied by the war god's dragon instead of your own. Aren't we both borrowing someone else's dragon? Don't you dare compare me to you, she hissed. I am still a dragon master. I am your nothing but the most useless of your parents' children, he shouted. Of all the prospective brides he could have sent the king, he sent a dragonless, powerless one. How pathetic, princess! Nothing you own isn't inherited from your parents, yet you dare to lecture me? I am the lord of the Yekara clan, the most powerful clan leader of this kingdom. I fought and I killed for this position. And soon, I will be the most powerful man in this entire kingdom. Dream on, groaned Ashen. I'm never letting that happen, Yebek. I'll have your head sliced off your neck and hung on the castle walls before the sun sets. Fierce as ever, King Ashen, laughed Yebek. But you are no more deserving than your partner here. You were nothing but your father's discarded runt, and as expected, you grew up to be a barking mutt. Ashen swung his sword left, in a smooth and perfectly controlled movement, pointing at his enemy's throat, although he was still too many steps away to cut it off. Keep talking, Yebek. I won't be swayed by your words anymore. You're only good at slithering your way into places of power and then hiding behind someone, aren't you? Let me guess. You were about to do the very same thing with my brother. He's of no use to you, after all. Once you get rid of me, you could put yourself on the throne, but no. Instead, you'd rather choose your pawn and hide behind him, then change when it is comfortable for you. You have no idea what you're talking about, crowed Yebek, stepping forward. Men like you, like your father, are nothing but pathetic figures for the people to watch, but you have no idea about true power, the power to lead men, the power to keep these citizens in control. A feminine chuckle stopped his rant. Furious, his eyes went to Cecilia, who had a smile on. What are you finding so funny, princess? He shouted. You. He was about to say something, most likely some insult, but Cecilia stepped up first, pushing the tip of her blade against the nearest soldier's chest, with a glare of warning, having the man cautiously step back. You know nothing about the citizens of this kingdom, Cecilia calmly said. You're right. You are no king. You're no leader, either. You're nothing but a vicious snake. You wench. Ashen won't have any problem dealing with you, she muttered. Yebeka's face was gradually becoming deformed by rage, but that only made Ashen happier, a smile appearing on his face. You're no princess. You're nothing but a little wench, he shouted. No, you snake face, grinned Ashen, raising his sword again. She's a queen. My queen. He swung his sword, this time slicing one of Yebeka's remaining men in two. The fight resumed, even fiercer than before. Even if it only looked like insults had been exchanged, the truth was that both Cecilia and Ashen had been able to catch a break thanks to that. This was the bit of energy they had needed to fight even harder than before. The remaining fighters were soon down to 5, then only 4, then 3, all of them growing visibly wary of the unstoppable couple. Cecilia and Ashen weren't unscathed. Cuts had appeared on the parts of their bodies that weren't covered by the armor, and they had blood, sweat, and dust covering the previously shiny scales. Their muscles were sore from 2 days of relentless fighting, and they had one too many internal injuries already. If anything, they finally seemed human while fighting, but there was a silent grace to the passion they put into the fight. They didn't seem to swing their weapons so effortlessly, but their fights were more admirable, given how the pair was working together to get rid of their opponents. In the end, they still found ways to get the upper hand. Not because they were physically stronger, but because they kept acting like a perfect combo, trained by the very best, using the best techniques, flawless moves, and sharp senses to best their opponents. And they did. When the last of Yebeka's men got down on their knees, Ashen made a point of staring right into the Lord's eyes while mercilessly slicing that last throat. Cecilia was a bit out of breath too, standing next to him with her eyes riveted on the ceiling, listening for more dragon growls. She was standing so close her back was touching his arm, each feeling the other's presence without needing to look. Yebek had witnessed the whole fight, yet his eyes still turned red with rage while staring at the bodies layered between the duo and him, as if realizing the truth only now. Ashen swung his sword and got rid of the excess blood. You're next, Yebek, he hissed. Oh, no, chuckled the lord with a sadistic smile. Did you forget, my lord? I am not the one competing for the crown. Shocked, Ashen's eyes turned to the throne, just in time to see his adopted brother jumping toward him, sword first. Ashen only had the reflex to push Cesilia out of the way, while Rowan's sword violently stabbed his shoulder. Ashen! Cecilia's scream echoed in the tower like a thunderbolt. They had both made the mistake to completely disregard the one-legged man in the room, as opposed to all the warriors they had fought before. She hadn't even thought that adopted brother of his still had the strength to stand up, let alone to launch an attack. Yet, Ashen's blood did splatter on her face, while she clearly witnessed Rowan's evil grin. That man had put on the prosthesis they had seen before when they weren't watching, and was now very clearly able to stand and face them. He was out of breath, but visibly very proud of the injury he had just caused to Ashen. "That's it," he said with a rugged voice. "I told you I'd get back at you, brother." Cecilia wanted to run to Ashen, but she felt something was wrong before she could put her finger on it. The injury on Ashen's shoulder was deep and long, but it shouldn't have impaired him. Yet, she clearly saw her lover stagger, and have trouble getting back on his feet. Above them, as if to echo the dramatic situation, Jin growled again. Its claws appeared at one of the windows, crushing the stone frame. Ashen glanced that way, before his eyes went back to his brother, holding his shoulder. "Poison?" he hissed. "Yes, brother," chuckled Rowan. "I know, it's not very fair, but I needed a little help to make this fight a bit more balanced." Another scary sound of crumbling stones echoed above them. A portion of the tower made a very worrying sound, making all four of them look up. Jin growled again, obviously trying to dig its way into a tower half as small as it. After a second, Yebek chuckled nervously. "I think you're the one he wants, princess. That dragon is desperate to kill you, and save his mistress." Cecilia barely heard him. Her heart was torn between Ashen's injury, and the growling dragon outside. Even if it was meant to be against her, she wasn't insensitive to Jin's distress. Dragons were a part of her, after all, and she could tell the young dragon's despair. "Go." She turned her head to Ashen, who was gathering his senses, clenching his fists around his sword's handle. "Ashen! Go, Cecilia. I got this, and you need to calm that dragon down. I can handle these two, but if this place collapses, we will all be dead for nothing." She knew he was right, but she was still reluctant to leave. Another growl and stone-breaking sound made the decision for her, though. She carefully stepped back, getting behind Ashen, her eyes watching the crumbled window already. If she could get Jin to follow her, Ashen and this room would be safe, but she didn't want to abandon him to face his adopted brother and Lord Yebek alone, after he had been poisoned. "Just go," he insisted calmly. "I trust you. I love you." Cecilia's heart dropped. His words were exactly what she needed. Yes, they trusted each other, and they could rely on the other. They were no longer once strangers. She clenched her fists, and quickly, stepped up to him, putting a quick kiss on his shoulder before running to the door behind them. "I trust you too," she muttered, before running out of the room. She had one objective in mind: find Giselle to stop Jin. Or at least draw the dragon as far away as possible from the throne room it was about to destroy. Cecilia tried to remember the castle's complex map. She had to be somewhere she could catch Jin's attention, big enough for it not to crumble right away. She suddenly remembered. The room of the first banquet was on the same level. Cecilia ran, staying close to the windows. She was trying to catch sight or hear another dragon's growl, but the ruckus outside was just too much to hear anything else. Jin was still perilously climbing and growling, as it didn't look like the dragon had noticed her leaving that room. Finally, Cecilia reached the large, oval banquet hall and ran to the balcony where she could see the dragon on the nearby roof. She whistled, as loud as she could, finally getting Jin's attention. The red dragon turned its head to her, looking confused, while Cecilia carefully retreated, ready. It didn't take more than a few seconds for Jin to react and, in 2 jumps it landed on the roof above her, while Cecilia ran back inside. "Are you done playing with my dragon?" suddenly said a calm voice. Cecilia turned around, just in time to see Giselle closing the large doors behind her, with a slight close-lipped smile. "Giselle?" groaned Cecilia. "Yeah," she answered. "See, Princess, perhaps you should have killed me after all." "I gave you a chance to go," said Cecilia. "I know," sighed Giselle. "Sadly, that's not much of a choice for me." Cecilia frowned. That woman was an enigma to her. A part of her acknowledged how similar they were, yet so different too. Both with dragons that weren't theirs, trying to find a place for their broken identities. Both carrying the dragon blood, without having their own dragon. The red-haired woman slowly walked up to the balcony, opposite to Cecilia, where Jin jumped to meet her. The dragon growled softly, a kind of growl Cecilia knew all too well, that showed affection to its favorite human. Giselle turned her back to the young dragon, but Jin growled again, and gently nudged her shoulder with its snout. She sighed, and finally raised a hand to pet the red scales. The dragon growled again in appreciation, rubbing against her hand and closing its eyes. "Why didn't you run?" Cecilia asked, confused. "My brother saved you once, but you chose to ally yourself with the Yekara. Again. Where would I run to?" Giselle scoffed. "You're mistaken, Princess. You think I'm free, but this whole continent is my prison. There is no place for a woman like me. Both the Dragon Empire and the Eastern Kingdom will not let a woman with a roaming dragon live in peace. What is the point of leaving now that they know about Jin? It's all a matter of time before I'm caught and used again. No. I'm sick of being manipulated." She turned to the dragon, faintly smiling at it. Once again, Cecilia noticed Giselle actually held some feelings for the young dragon. Perhaps it wasn't as strong as its real owner, but she did like the dragon, and sincerely felt connected to it. Jin was even more obvious, mirroring what its deceased owner's feelings should have been, those of a brother toward a beloved older sister. Cecilia's younger siblings' dragons acted the very same with her, always asking for cuddles even if their young masters pretend otherwise. Dragons were often more in tune with their owner's deep feelings than the superficial ones that wouldn't last. Jin was carrying its previous master's inner feelings all the same. "I did consider fleeing," she said, "but I decided a long time ago that the Eastern Kingdom would be my final home." "Do you have any idea what it's like, Princess, when you have no home at all? My father used my mother, and then he used me. My own mother used my little brother to get more of my despicable father's attention. I bet you grew up witnessing nothing but love and care from your own family, but all I got from mine were shackles, betrayal, and poisonous feelings." She sighed, and turned her eyes back to Cecilia. "We're both princesses, after all, aren't we? We have the same grandfather." Sadly, my mother was just one of many, many disposable princesses. First, she was used, abused by her brother, and then, she fell in love with another monster. Not all princesses get their happy ending with a prince, Princess Cecilia. My life has been nothing but running away. I lived in the dark corners of a gigantic palace, like a rat. I hid from every adult that should have protected me. When we fled that palace, and I thought I'd finally get some room to breathe, things got even worse. Neither my brother's birth or Jin's appearance were the ray of hope I should have had. They made my parents crazier instead. Yet, my younger brother got attached to me, the only other person capable of actually caring for him without twisted feelings, but instead of being twisted, my feelings were non-existent. Numb. I was in constant survival mode ever since I was born. How could it have been any different? She flicked her red hair over her shoulder and began moving around the room, walking next to the walls facing Cecilia. Meanwhile, Cecilia was getting ready to fight. She didn't think Giselle would have trapped her here if it wasn't to end things. It didn't seem like she had any weapon but a small dagger in her right hand, though, which was clearly not enough. I fled. I lied, I stole. I sold myself too. I did literally anything a woman could do to survive. I mixed myself up with people I thought I belonged with, but then again, my lineage kept coming back like a curse. I wear it on my skin, after all. Plus, hiding a dragon isn't all that easy. She chuckled, seemingly admiring some invisible detail in the wall. You could have lived freely by yourself, said Cecilia, with Jin to protect you. No one should have been able to hurt you. Giselle suddenly turned to her with angry eyes. Oh, but that's where we're different, princess. Unlike you, I'm not one to hide behind a dragon. I don't rely on Jin, like I have never relied on anybody but myself. Look at you. You might be the war god's daughter, but you're nothing but a coward. Don't. What? Scoffed Giselle. Aren't I telling the truth? You were born with everything. Parents who loved you. Caring siblings, and even your own dragon. And what did you do? You betrayed every single one of them. You were dumb enough to lose your dragon and to leave your family for a man. You don't know anything about me. Of course I know, she retorted, a vicious smile on her lips. It's written all over you. I've been watching you, curious about what kind of woman Ashen was so madly in love with. But what a disappointment! You're afraid of your own shadow, princess. I'm sick of you and your sick manner of always acting so fragile. Even that stupid stutter of yours. You're not just scared, you're someone eaten up by guilt. I can see the pieces fitting together. You lost your dragon for a man, and you lost your family's trust. Isn't it ironic? You lost pretty much the only part of you that made you oh so special, and now, you're so afraid of showing what a disappointment you are to everyone, that you act like this. Shut up. Cecilia violently punched the column next to her, furious. Even Giselle stopped her pacing, surprised, and looked up at the marble that trembled. The spot where the princess fist had hit the stone was literally dug in by a couple of inches, and the whole structure was echoing a worrisome creaking. After a second, Giselle seemed to regain control of herself again, with a faint chuckle. "Look at that! I'm right, aren't I? You know you're not worthy of what you have. Your own brothers had to come and rescue you from the mess you can't clean up by yourself. Your mere presence in this kingdom ruined it. Ashen would have been fine if you hadn't come. I would have been perfectly fine, by his side. You know, I truly believed it, for a while. I was fine with being a mere mistress. I was fine with being called his whore, the king's slut, as long as I could live safely, peacefully. But no. You had to come here, and once again, ruin everything I was entitled to." Suddenly, Giselle also punched the wall next to her. The impact wasn't big enough to cause as much damage as Cecilia's fist had, but it did leave a monstrous hole in the previously perfect marble, and make more of the wall creak. A few steps back behind her, Jin growled angrily at Cecilia, all fangs out. The dragon was now trying to get more of its head into the room, although the window was obviously too small. "I would have been fine staying in the shadows," bitterly muttered Giselle. "Once again. Hiding in the shadows of this castle. It's not like I hadn't done it before. Except, this one, there would be no father or uncle to chase me. I could have simply been here, quiet and patient. I thought I could be happy, just this one time. However, things aren't that easy, in a man's world." She scoffed. "He had to prove his stupid, childish love to you, once again. You know, I didn't love him, but I did hope he wouldn't abandon me like most had. I thought I had found a broken, but righteous man. However, a mistress is nothing but an eyesore when the real lady comes, isn't she? He had to get rid of me." "He let you go," said Cecilia. "You could have gone anywhere. The continent is so vast." "I did not want to go anywhere," shouted Giselle. "I wanted to make this place my home. Do you have any idea what it's like, to have to flee, over and over again? How many times will I have to depend on a man's goodwill to survive?" "You don't need a man," Cecilia shouted back. "You have a dragon, and you're such a smart woman by yourself. You made it this far alone. You could settle anywhere you want and start over. Is that what you think? That I made it this far alone? I relied my whole life on a man's goodwill, Princess Cecilia. My father, my uncle, all those I slept with, in exchange for food, shelter, or safety. Do you think a woman alone can ever make it on her own, without being bothered by a man? True, I have a dragon. But once men become aware of Jin, what do you think will happen to him? He'll be hunted and killed, or used. Don't you know best? You were a girl with a dragon, and you left your father's home once. What happened to your dragon then?" Cecilia's blood went cold. "Cease. Her beloved Cease was killed." Giselle's words brought back the haunting memory of that night. The men's horrible voices, smell, touch. Just remembering any of that nightmare made her stomach twist and want to puke her guts out. It was the most terrifying night of her life. She wasn't much like a dragon at all, back then. Just a vulnerable girl, with fear paralyzing her and pinning her down. She hated it. She hated that she had been so powerless, when she had wielded a sword for the first time at 6, and learned to fight long before that. Yet, there were no words for the horrible, paralyzing fear that had overtaken her back then. "That's right," said Cecil. "That's the look. When we hate both the gender we were born in, and the stronger. See, princess? I told you we were more similar than you think. We both know what it's like, to have your life in somebody else's hands. We live in a man's world. Having a dragon, or being a princess, doesn't change a thing. Don't tell me again that I do not need a man. Or live by your words, and leave Ashen and this kingdom." Cecilia clenched her fists. "I can't," she muttered. "Why not? Are you going to tell me about something as foolish as love, perhaps? Don't bother, then. Keep living in your fairy tale, princess. But this one won't have a good ending." She suddenly reached one of the tables in the banquet hall, and pulled out a medium-length sword from underneath it. Cecilia frowned. Had that been hidden here all along? Or did Cecil put it there? The red-haired woman swung the sword easily, as if she was familiar with it. Surprised, chuckled Cecil. "I needed a place to hide it quickly after killing that Pangaha girl." It suddenly hit Cecilia. The murder at the banquet. Cecil had vouched for her being on the balcony with the king during the murder, but she had no alibi herself, aside from her brief appearance during their interaction. So she really was the one behind Vina's brutal murder. Cecilia couldn't even say it came as much of a shock. She had her suspicions from the beginning. "You were working for the Yekara all along." "Not that long. But when I heard about the competition and you arrived, Lord Yebek was smart enough to offer me a deal. If one of his candidates got the throne, he would happily offer me a mansion to live in comfortably, as long as I got out of the picture. At first, I had no intention to betray Ashen, but when you appeared, I did try to extend a hand to you, but sadly, you refused, and the choice was quickly made. I knew Ashen marrying you would have a very different outcome than him marrying any other candidate. He didn't care for them, but I knew he'd get rid of me if he was worried about what you'd say, and I was right, once again. The Yekara tried to use you all along, Cecil. They were never going to let you live." "I know that too," chuckled Cecil, "but I also had my own hidden card." Jin growled in response, trying to chew a bit more of the window's frame. For now, it was too small for the dragon's head to come in, but at this rate, Jin would surely break enough of it to actually get in. The two women finally stepped closer to each other. Cecilia held on to her weapons a bit tighter, trying to evaluate the situation. She had never seen Cecil actually fight, but from the amount of strength displayed earlier, she definitely had inherited the dragon blood too. Not only that, but the way she moved her sword showed she had received decent training. How? During her years fleeing the Empire? She couldn't tell. Either way, she was not expecting that woman to fight fairly. Cecil wasn't even glancing at her dragon trying to break into the room and wrecking the balcony, meaning she expected Jin to step into the game at any time. The worst part of all was that Cecilia couldn't feel any real hatred coming from that woman. It was even scarier than if she had really intended to kill her. This was like Vena's murder, brutal and cold-blooded. A faint smile even appeared on Giselle's lips as they got closer. It feels like it was all bound to come to this, right? She muttered. You and I. Two women fighting for a man. No, because of a man. I'm not that interested in the king anymore. He's about to die, and the Yekara will marry their daughter to his adopted brother before getting rid of him too. Such a simple plan, but then again, this kingdom is already on its knees. You don't know a thing about this kingdom, said Cecilia, lifting her weapons. And you do? Giselle mocked. Without waiting, Cecilia jumped forward, launching the first strike. Surprised, Giselle frowned and lifted her two blades just in time to block her. The two women's blades loudly clashed, and for a few seconds, they measured each other's strength, trying to push the other's defense, their faces only inches away from each other. Their styles were somewhat similar, using the flow of their movements, rather than brute force, and trying to outmaneuver their opponent. For a while, it was as if a red fire and a purple-scaled creature were dancing around each other, trying to burn or bite the other, looking for a weakness. They never split up for more than a couple of seconds, before throwing themselves at each other again. Their style was superb, flawless, and fierce. It was nothing like the rugged fights from before, or between men using only their brute strength. Each woman was using her best skill, her wits, and showing off impressive fighting choreography. Giselle was dancing with her two mismatched blades as if they had been extensions of herself, while Cecilia balanced herself perfectly with her identical weapons. Despite the difference in their respective styles, the flow of their movements was sharp and swift, looking for the smallest window to attack, using speed and reflexes to try and best the other. Neither of them were showing any mistakes, always in motion, their light steps never touching the floor for more than a second. Their dance was like a death ritual, with the thunder and dragon's furious growls as background percussion. Pearls of sweat appeared on their skin, as each woman was getting frustrated with the other. After a while, they broke apart, by just a few steps, catching a quick break. The two women were now circling around each other like two furious wolves ready to bite one another. "Ush should have left, Giselle," muttered Cecilia. "You already said that, princess. But you know what? I think the same of you. You don't belong here. You're a coward. And without your dragon, well, you're nothing." The furious princess thrust her swords at her again, and Giselle blocked it with a smile on her lips. They began fighting for real, their four blades hitting each other for a few minutes, the metallic clashes echoing throughout the banquet hall. Their fight was violent, cold, and merciless. Both of them were glaring at one another, looking for the next place to viciously hit and try to hurt the other. The more hits their weapons exchanged, the more Cecilia felt her blood boiling. Giselle's repeated smirks were annoying her, as if that woman always mocked her. She tried to keep fighting and remain focused, but it was too late. The venom from Giselle's words were slowly poisoning her mind. She kept thinking about what she had said, and about Cece. Was she right? Probably. At least, when it came to her being a coward. Cecilia felt the same. She had felt that for a long time now, but the more she tried to push that thought away, the more vivid it came to her mind. Saying she was afraid of her own shadow wasn't a lie either. It was just as Cashin had said, she was scared of looking back at the Cecilia from before. She couldn't even remember what kind of girl she was before she had lost Cease. All she could think of, whenever she tried, was the painful result of her mistake. The guilt that was choking her up and tightening its claws around her voice all the time. Was it really love that had brought her back to Ashen, or the need to prove she was right to do what she had done for that love of theirs? It was suffocating just to think about it. Cecil was right. Her own anger, sadness, and remorse had been slowly building up inside, in all those words she had never dared to say. She resented herself for the weakness she had shown back then when her dragon needed her. Even more today. "You don't deserve a dragon," grunted Cecil, as their weapons clashed again. "That's right. You're too weak. Too much of a coward." She suddenly managed to graze Cecilia's arm. Not a deep wound, but the sharp edge of her blade suddenly sliced the skin that was showing between the parts of Cecilia's armor, leaving a vivid red line. Far from being bothered by the pain, Cecilia suddenly swung beautifully, and sent a violent flying kick toward her opponent, throwing Cecil far across the room. It wasn't enough to injure her, though, as the redhead fell back on her feet, a victorious smile on her lips. "Ha! See! The precious daughter of the god of war is nothing but..." She stopped herself upon seeing Cecilia's eyes. The princess was now standing completely still, suddenly looking different, almost taller. Her eyes were shining with a dangerous, vivid green fire in them, as if lit up by some inner flame. Cecilia stepped forward, and despite the distance between them, Cecil stepped back, scared. Something felt off, as if she was suddenly faced with a completely different person. Someone that was not human. "You were right," she said with a strangely calm, almost mesmerizing voice. "I am done being a coward. I am done being sorry and afraid." She looked down, frowning. "There is some truth in what you said. I was always dependent on Ashen's love. Not because I didn't truly love him, but because I could hide behind that to excuse what had happened to Cease." Cecilia's heart ached painfully at the mention of her deceased dragon. Yet, she took a deep breath in. She'd had enough of resisting this pain. She didn't even try to hold back her tears. "It was all my fault," she muttered. "Although my family was there to tell me it wasn't. Not because I went out. Not because I was captured while trying to reunite with Ashen. What those men did, none of that was my fault, that much is true. Whatever they were seeking, their misdeeds are their fault only. And they paid with their lives for it. The one thing I can never forgive myself for is that fear." Cecilia closed her eyes. She was done pushing that memory to the back of her mind, silencing it like her own voice had been silenced for so long. She didn't care anymore. No, she wasn't going to allow herself to flee from it any longer. "You said it," she continued. "I was paralyzed by fear. I was so terrified of what they'd do to me, of the pain I had already endured, that I couldn't react, even when they did that horrible thing to my dragon." She lifted her fingers, touching the scars on her neck. "For a long time, I couldn't even bear to see these. I couldn't bear the memory of that pain. I felt like they were still hurting like the first second their blades had opened my throat. I'd wake up in horror at night, terrorized. My mother had to drug me, just so I could endure it, but it wasn't the pain that really hurt me. It was to relieve the fear, and the pain in Cecily's eyes, over and over again. My dragon didn't die for me. She died because of me. Because I was too paralyzed by fear to fight back. Cecilia suddenly reopened her eyes, once again burning with a green, scary flame inside. Cecil could feel something was completely different about her. It was as if she was facing an entirely different woman. Even her posture was straighter, taller, looking like her real height. When the princess resumed walking toward her, she backed off again, realizing she only had a few steps left between the wall behind and herself. Right now, her whole body was screaming to get out of there, to put as many walls as possible between her and that woman's green eyes. And you know what? The worst part is that I am still afraid to fight back. I've been afraid for so long, because I've seen the monster in those men's eyes. And I knew that if I let go, even just one bit, of my fear, the anger I was building up inside would eat me up, and make me a monster too. She did have the eyes of a monster right then. The eyes of a furious dragon, stuck on her prey with a murderous, terrifying intent. Cecil kept backing away, raising her blades in a protective stance, but Cecilia's cold and composed approach was just paralyzing her with fear. She felt like she had unleashed something in that woman, and would only regret it once she got over there much too soon. You're just thinking this is because of Ashen, said Cecil, in an attempt to say something, anything to save herself. You think his love has made you stronger. This has nothing to do with my love for Ashen. Suddenly, she was there, and her attack came from the sky, only leaving Cecil half a second to put her blades up. It was the same amount of strength as before, so why was she so scared? She could keep up with that woman, she had the strength to measure up to her. So why did she feel like Cecilia had grown into an absolute beast in just a matter of seconds? Their blades clashed, and Cecil rolled to the side, cautiously using the opportunity to put some more distance between them. Still, Cecilia's eyes wouldn't leave her alone as the princess followed her every single step. You know nothing about what love is supposed to be, Cecil. You only ever saw him as your way to survive. You used him. So what? You're no better than I am. You only hid behind him like a coward. No, Cecilia retorted. Do you know why I love Ashen so much? He's not as special as you, or everyone else, is trying to push him to be. He was never meant to be a king's son. He's just a man, like any other out there. He's not a great king, and he's full of flaws too. His bad temper, his stubbornness. He's made tons of mistakes, and I know it all too well. He can't even trust people close to him, and that's all why I love him even more. He's imperfect, and he's broken, just like me. But, at least Ashen's true to his feelings, he gets mad when he's mad, and he never fears his own voice. He doesn't flee from his responsibilities, and he knows how to bear the blame for his own mistakes and flaws. While all I did, for all these years, was push my own responsibilities to the back of my mind and act like a victim. At the opposite window, Jin kept growling furiously, almost covering Cecilia's voice with the ruckus. The dragon's red-scaled paws were slowly digging their way inside the room, weakening the whole structure of the tower the banquet hall belonged to. The walls around and above the windows Jin was destroying were starting to creak dangerously, thin dust coming off as a warning of a potential collapse. Still, neither of the two women bothered to try and stop the dragon from smashing its way into the room. Cecil was actually hoping her dragon would get there soon to help her, while Cecilia couldn't be bothered. No one could tell if she was even hearing the dragon coming in behind her, the thunder above their heads, and the ruckus coming from the streets. "But I'm done," she said. "You were right, Cecil. I'm done being a coward." They swung their swords at each other again. The two women resumed their battle, fiercer, faster, more violent than before. It was down to who would be able to kill the other first. They weren't leaving any time for rest, every second was passed trying to pierce the other's defenses. It was a continuous ballet of blades, blocking or attacking relentlessly. They were flying and dancing around the banquet hall as if it had been just the right size to contain their attacks, as pieces of furniture were regularly stabbed and sliced in their stead, or violently thrown across the room to make way. The strength of their attacks was no less than that of a battle between male warriors. Those two had the dragon blood flowing fiercely through their veins, fueling the adrenaline and making them as aggressive as dragons ferociously defending their territory. There was no territory to defend, only the burning desire to best the other woman and get rid of their opponent. "It doesn't change a thing," muttered Cecil as soon as Cecilia gave her a second to catch her breath. "Once a coward, always a coward, princess. Don't think you can change just because you're a bit mad now." "Oh, I'm beyond mad," hissed Cecilia, "and I won't allow myself to be a coward anymore." She furiously struck again, Cecil's sword barely appearing in time to block her attack. Yet, she wasn't done, and not leaving her opponent any chance. Cecilia immediately spun around, and struck again, aiming at her flank this time. Cecil stopped it again, but too late. She was thrown violently to the side, forced to drop her dagger as her flank brutally hitting the ground. "You know, for a while, I even feared that my dragon would actually come back," said Cecilia, "because I wouldn't know how to face her. I was that afraid of facing my own mistake that deep down, I really thought she was better off dead than with an owner like me." She struck as Cecil was still on the ground, leaving her to raise her sword above her body to protect herself. It didn't matter how Cecil held her sword up, Cecilia relentlessly attacked, again and again. However, behind all her reckless stabbing, teardrops began to appear. She wasn't trying to kill her opponent, her reckless attacks endlessly hit the blade of Cecil's sword, putting enormous pressure on the redhead, but without actually targeting her for real underneath her sword. No, instead, Cecilia was putting all of her rage into every single strike. Her arms were swinging with furious strength, like she could have kept punching a wall in anger. Those tears were coming from her inner rage, bottled up all these years, more than the hatred she felt for Cecil. She was mad, furious at herself. She had tried to be good, to only allow herself to hide in the fear of that memory, while keeping the anger away. She had been so scared of letting that anger come out, scared of what she would have been capable of, if she had let her fury come out that day. Cecilia could almost remember the bitter disappointment in her heart when she had heard her brothers and father had already killed those men. And 1 second later, she had been shocked with the thoughts that had come to her mind, of what she would have been capable of doing to them herself if she had grasped her chance for revenge. It had been a constant trap. Fear, anger, fear of herself again. Fear of becoming the same kind of monster she had seen in those monsters' eyes. Cecilia had always admired her mother, and she wanted to be kind, gentle, like her. But she had her father's strength, and the blood of a dragon running through her veins. Her mother wasn't capable of killing people twice her size, but she was. And right now, she felt like she had finally reached that point, where the dragon inside could finally be free, after being trapped for so long and for all the wrong reasons. She suddenly stopped striking and took a step back, catching her breath, and wiping her tears. "See, Cecil. I'm done being a coward like you. Hiding behind a man or my cousin. Behind a dragon, behind any excuse. I am done passing for the one that needs protection. I am no weak, hurt child anymore." Just as she shouted that, the wall behind them violently burst open. With a terrifying roar, Jin crawled into the room, the large red head immediately going for Cecilia. The princess only had time to turn around and raise her swords before she was brutally thrown across the room. A hilt escaped her fingers, and her back violently hit the opposite wall, her whole body shaking inside the armor. Even as she fell down, Cecilia had to immediately curl and try to protect herself from the stones crumbling above her. It was like a landslide, trying to bury her alive. She heard Cecil scream and shout something to her dragon, but it was barely heard through the ruckus. Cecilia quickly dug herself out with painful grunts, before Jin's claws cut through the mountain covering her. The young dragon wasn't just trying to kill her, it was wrecking the whole place. Luckily, the mass destruction going on allowed Cecilia to get away on all fours, while Jin couldn't see or smell her through the mess of crumbling stones and clouds of dust filling the air. Cecilia quickly found a spot under a table to hide briefly, and catch her breath while witnessing the havoc in the room. Half of the tower's wall had been busted open, along with the roof above, leaving it exposed to the raging storm outside. In fact, Cecilia had been thrown against the edge of the half still standing, away from the only door and stairs out of there. Cecil was back on her feet, in the middle of the room, vociferating like a mad woman. "Kill her! Kill her! She's there!" Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.